introduction. Could I just begin by telling you all how thrilled I am to be here? For several reasons, the first of which is that, as Elsa suggested, I do think that I witnessed something of a miracle after my bizarre journey, sort of wandering randomly across the Pacific in both directions. I do think it's kind of a miracle that I made it here at all, so I'm very grateful for that. Secondly, I'm sure that you're aware that we are rapidly approaching the climax of the American election season. And so by inviting me here, you have given me the opportunity to do what 90% of Americans would like to do right now, which is flee the country. So thank you very much for that. But of course, I'm mostly thrilled to be here because this is a worldwide order, and it's so easy if you stay home all the time to just sort of think it's you and your buddies getting together once a month or however often, and talking about things you have in common, as opposed to realizing that this is a lot bigger than that. And so thank you for the opportunity to come and meet sisters and brothers in a part of the world that's completely new to me. I was saying before I left that people would ask me, have you been to New Zealand before? And I'd say, I've never even been to Hawaii before. Everyone in Seattle has been to Hawaii. Well, now I've been to Hawaii. I was there for 2 hours in the middle of the night, and it was very hot. And that's all I can tell you about it. When I got the invitation to come here and speak on this subject, simplicity, living simply in a complex world, I had to just laugh, honestly. I thought, what can they be thinking? I actually admitted in following Francis that I really am not very good at this whole simplicity thing, and that I find it extremely challenging and kind of embarrassing, actually, how little of a grasp I have of this topic. So I thought, well, probably what they're thinking is, at least you'll be honest anyway. So I will try to do that much at least. Now, my assumption about convocations is that when people come to convocation, they really don't come to hear the speaker, which doesn't mean I'm not going to speak, but I am a lecturer after all, is what I do. But I assume that people don't really come to hear the speaker. I assume that when people come to convocation, it's mainly for two things. One is to see each other, and the other is to reconnect to their Franciscan vocation. And so I feel that my job really is not to spend the whole time talking at you. Most of us hate being talked at. And so what I would like to do is do a bit of talking, but also make this a bit more interactive than just me sort of all doing it in one direction. So I thought I would begin by giving you a little bit of a roadmap for where these sessions are going to go, so that you'll have some idea of where we're headed. So in this first session, and I have no idea what the timing of all of this is going to be like, so we'll just sort of play it as we go. But in the first section, I'd like to take on the whole issue of the complexities of simplicity. And I'd like to, I apologize for using this word because I really hate it, but there just isn't a better one. I'd like to problematize the subject. I'm so sorry. I know that's the worst of academia coming out of me, but I can't help it sometimes. So we're going to look at the complexities of simplicity. And then in session 2, I'd like us to move inward a bit and look at inner simplicity, sort of clearing away the junk and getting closer to something that approximates purity of heart. And then in the third one, we'll continue that inward movement and talk about simplicity of our very self, of our very identity. And this is what you get for inviting somebody who's got another book project going, because I'm actually working on a book now that looks at the self and identity and how that can be fractured, and then how through contemplation especially they can be healed. And so look for that to come out in another year or two. It's called The Sacred Gaze, and I'm this close to a contract, so I'm very excited. Commercial is over, advert is done. So after doing those two sessions that are going to be kind of the inward focus, then for our final session, I'd like to bring it back out again and look at the how shall we then live question. And talk about the implications of the interior stuff for our outward practice of simplicity. So that's where we're going with all of this. So we're kind of starting at the outward level, moving in, and then moving out again. So if these talks are going to go in a somewhat unexpected direction, it's because you really didn't need me to come all the way from Seattle to tell you to recycle your newspapers and that nobody needs to own 6 pairs of black boots, right? So I'm sort of assuming a certain level of familiarity with simplicity and then thinking that maybe we could go a little deeper than that, or at least we could go into it at a level that maybe we don't ordinarily spend a lot of time on. So before we do anything else, I would like to just turn it over to you for a moment and ask you, before I say much, that might interfere with your own thought processes, I'd like to ask you to either write down, if you have the materials with you, or at least just think of 2 to 3 things about simplicity that you find particularly challenging. Okay, so it can be simplicity in general, or it can be simplicity in your own rule. So just take about a minute or so to think of 2 or 3 things about simplicity that you find particularly challenging. So what does it mean to live simply in a complex world? When I first was told that this was going to be the theme for these meetings, I was sort of overwhelmed by the complexity of the question. I mean, where do you begin to attack something like this, living simply in a complex world? It made me just kind of want to take to my bed for a few days. But then most things do, actually. So I'm going to have us kind of try to confront the chaos a little bit before we can see whether we can make any kind of order out of it. So what I'd like to do then is have a kind of 3 quick lessons in simplicity be the content for the rest of this session. So 3 quick lessons. So part 1. Simplicity is a lot more complicated than it seems. And I figured I might as well start with a bit of heresy because, that's always fun. Not so much a heretical statement as a heretical question. If you think about the history of Francis himself and the history of the order, of the movement that he founded, one of the things that I think is common is to think about how, Francis and his first followers really had the whole simplicity thing down, the poverty thing, and they were so radical and they were so dedicated. And then what happened? Before the man was even dead, they had started to compromise. Right? And then, even during his lifetime, but especially after his death, there was this conflict between those who wanted to adhere strictly to Francis' vision about poverty and those who thought, well, honestly, can't we be a little bit more realistic? Let's relax this a little bit. After all, we don't want to be legalistic, et cetera, et cetera. And so in flow the excuses and all that. And it's easy to sort of see that as a kind of tragic moment for the Franciscan Way, when, the moment of compromise, the moment of selling out, the vision of Francis and Clare. But the heretical question that I want to ask is this. Suppose it hadn't happened that way. I mean, the movement grew pretty rapidly, and before you knew it, Europe was filled with Franciscans. There were Franciscans everywhere. You couldn't, swing a cat without hitting a Franciscan. And so, what would have happened if all of them had been living the way that Francis and the first ones did? Europe would have been filled with beggars, with people who had voluntarily embraced poverty. The thing is that Europe was already filled with poor people. And so I wonder what would have happened if all those people who were not voluntarily poor had suddenly had, competition, a few meters down the road from somebody who had the option and had chosen to be poor. I mean, I don't know. I think, maybe it was a mercy that the movement went the way it did. But we don't often think of it that way, do we? I often think of my own life and figure, well, if I had been one of those early ones, I would have been calling for compromise and selling out all over the place. Because when I look at my own life, honestly, I just don't see myself having all that much in common with Francis and Clare. And I wonder, in what sense, apart from the fact that I own one of these, profession crosses, and I use the word own deliberately, in what sense is my life Franciscan, really? I mean, it doesn't... I don't think Francis would recognize me, but I do have this much in common with Francis and Clare, that when I was young, when I was 17, in fact, I also left home and joined a somewhat sketchy religious movement. And we were all renouncing all our worldly goods, and we were living communally. We were going to live the gospel. We were not going to have ordinary type jobs. We were going to be out there evangelizing and doing good works and helping the poor and all this kind of stuff. And it was a nice idea. And the response of my family was about like theirs. I didn't have to strip naked before the bishop, fortunately. I don't think either of us would have enjoyed that. But my parents did everything but haul me away, And so I have a lot of affection for Claire, whose family responded essentially as mine did. But at 17, it wasn't so much. I renounced all my worldly goods, right? All of my worldly goods could have been put in a shopping bag and carried away without effort by a small child. All right, I didn't have any worldly goods. I gave away a necklace, I remember that. But, really, I suppose it was about renouncing my future, because had I gone straight from high school to university, my parents would have paid my way, and since I didn't, I ended up having to do it largely on my own. But I guess none of us had much. And so when we gave away our worldly possessions, we pretty much gave them to ourselves. Okay, so anyone who joined us gave up what they had to us, but we still didn't have much, because all we had were a bunch of people who were ex-hippies or drug addicts or street people or what have you. And so long story to make this point, that yes, we tried to do the Francis thing, but what ended up happening was that we ended up needing other people to support us. And because poor people are always more generous than rich people, usually we pretty much were going to poor people and asking them for help. And so, it felt like a really nice gesture, but honestly, what did we accomplish by doing that? We were actually in competition with the poor for what meager resources were available to them. And so, we didn't see that at the time. We were all about living the gospel. But, I can't resist telling you this story of my thought processes at age 17 when I realized that I didn't know how we were going to pay our bills. And so it was the first time I'd ever had to think of anything like that, because like a lot of people who sort of love the idea of living simply, I come from a very comfortable background, and so I had a lot of romantic ideas about that. But at any rate, when I first came face to face with the reality of having to pay bills and not having anything to pay them with, I started thinking creatively about how to accomplish this. And so a few years before that, my parents had given me a lovely bicycle. It was, a 10-speed. At that time, it was really a big deal. It probably cost over $100. And so I called them up and said, I have a bicycle. Would you like to buy it? My parents had bought me this bicycle, which I sold back to them. Because there's such a soft touch, and not once, not twice, but 3 times I sold that bicycle to my parents before they said, enough, either get a job or whatever, deal with it yourself. So lesson number 1 in simplicity is not that I was an egregious doofus as a teenager, although that's true. Obviously. But lesson number 1 is that simplicity is simple, except when it's not, except when it's complicated. and let's don't make it more simple than it is. I think it's important for us to have the honesty, the intellectual and personal integrity to deal with the complexities of trying to live simply in a complex world. It takes more than just going, okay, no shopping, check, right? It's got to go beyond that. And in fact, in dealing with the complexities of this, I can't help thinking of my students and how one of the things that I teach is an introduction to sociology course, and it's huge. My current one has between 250 and 300 students in it, which actually on our campus is not that huge, but it's a big class. And so at the end of it, on the closing day, as a conclusion, I wrap things up by kind of considering the different topics that we've talked about and so on, and I tell them, because one of those topics is education. We look at the American education system and ask questions like, do people have equal access to education? Is it fair? Is it an equitable system? And so on. And so I tell them, now, I'm going to give you the secret of looking like an educated person. So that I tell them, if you drop out of university tomorrow, and I hope you won't, but if you do, if you know this secret, you can pass for an educated person for the rest of your life. Okay? And I'll share this with you, just in case you're not already passing for an educated person, as I am. So what you do is you stroke your chin. It helps if you have a beard, but you work with what you've got. And cultivate a kind of far-off expression and go, actually, it's more complicated than that. And I tell them, if you never go to another class, if you never read another book, people will always think you're educated if you can say it's more complicated than that. And so I think we should begin by saying of simplicity, actually, it's more complicated than that. And then we'll all look and feel very smart. So even poverty isn't all that simple, but it's simpler than simplicity, don't you think? I mean, poverty is a kind of one-time decision. I mean, renouncing all your worldly possessions and then living without them is a one-time decision that is not, I'm not saying it's easy to live with that, but it's straightforward at least. Whereas with simplicity, you make daily decisions. It's this constant balancing act. It's this constant sort of questioning yourself about, well, is this too much, or is this enough, or what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to own this type of thing, or what? And so I find that simplicity is very, very complicated. So it's a series of daily decisions. So how do we go about making those decisions? This is part 2. Anyway, so lesson number 2 is this. It's not simplicity if it makes you become obsessive about stuff. You know, if you're constantly preoccupied with the things in your life, then I don't think that's simplicity. I mean, you can get so scrupulous about these things that you lose the joy, and I just don't think that's really the point. I think that if we're sort of overwhelmed with the need to be constantly vigilant about our consumption patterns and so on, then we slip into legalism, and that's not simplicity. So here's where I let this be a little bit more interactive. I would like to hear from you about your own processes. How do you balance these things? Like, how do you make these kinds of decisions about, you know, what constitutes simplicity, what's okay, what's on this side of the line, what's on the other side of the line? What are your processes that you go through to live this principle? Anyone? Bless you. I'm a teacher. I can wait you out.
I think the reality is when I'm busy, that I don't even think about it. And it's afterwards and I think, oh, do I need to do this? Or do I need to buy that? Or, you know, if I don't give myself space to think, reflect on something.
So you pretty much do it retrospectively?
Yeah, well, sometimes, not always.
So what would the ideal be then? To have time in the moment to reflect on whether you wanted to choose something or not? Or
Not be racing from one thing to the other.
Yeah. Oh, I so know that feeling. Yes.
I think for me it's not so much buying and owning things as having a light hold on them. When I do. So that if I had bought a sapphire necklace, to be able to say, well, actually, I could give it to Susan. But that's kind of...
You could. I'll leave you my address.
Something in there about...
I think that's very wise. And actually, it's one of the little exercises that I sometimes go through is to, if I think my hold is getting a little too tight on something, is to either give that thing away, or, as you said, or even imagine giving it away. I used to think about what would happen if my house were on fire, or there was an earthquake and it was all coming down around my ears. And I always thought, until my beloved dog died in June, I always thought I would scoop up the dog and that would be enough. I always prayed that if the house burned down, at least my dog wouldn't be in it, because the rest of it I didn't really care about. And so it's it's a little mental check, but I mean, that makes it sound like I always pass this test, right? And I really don't. So one of the things that I did recently was I was getting rid of a lot of old clothing, and I was thinking, I'll take it to one of those consignment shops. I don't know if that's what you call it here, but it's where you take your stuff and they... Okay, and they sell it and then they give you whatever. No, not that. No. This is where they sell it for you and they give you a take, okay? Yeah. So I was, so not the kind of give it away kind of place. And so I was thinking, I could, there's some good stuff in here, and I could get some money, and I could do this with it and that with it. And before I knew it, like my eyes were had little dollar signs in them, and I'm fantasizing about what I'd do with this vast accumulation of wealth. And I just thought, no. It's time to just give it away, just shove it all out to the curb, and have the charity people come and pick it up. But what else do you do? What are your processes?
I'm thinking, I'm very committed to buying free range, eggs and chicken and that sort of thing. But in fact, it actually costs big a lot more.
Yeah.
And yet, in the end, I think that the right picture of simplicity is actually holding on to something that is so important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because all of that stuff, the cage-free and the organic stuff and all that, but the cruelty-free stuff, it very often is more expensive. Fair trade. Oh yes, definitely.
One of the things that's happened for me and for many of my friends in Christchurch is that we've lost 2 or 3 sets of property and glass.
Oh yeah.
And it sort of becomes. I'm surprised at how many friends I've got who are still looking at what they've got in their place and saying, I need to get rid of some of this stuff.
Oh.
This stuff. And so it's actually created a life to hold on a lot of things, because here today, gone tomorrow.
Yeah.
The reality is there.
That's a really good. I mean, when things get taken from us without our consent, at least beforehand, we can still consent after the fact. And I've found, I actually talked in my second book, God in the Dark, I talked about how with suffering of various kinds, there's this whole sort of self-absorbed chapter on my back, and my back pain, I certainly didn't consent to that in advance, but once things happen to you, I don't know, there's a Gethsemane-like moment in which you can say to God, I didn't choose this, but if it's not your choice to take it away, then I consent. And I think that's really important. It's kind of hard to articulate why, but I think it's part of that, having a light hold on the things that we think are ours, like a pain-free body. Yeah.
Yes, for me, it's about being happy with what I've got and not really wanting any more. And I'm trying to do that.
And how often does that work out for you?
Well, I'm really happy with what I've got.
Yeah, good for you. Were you going to say something?
To say that a couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to go to the Franciscans to Solomon, and one of the things where people live the life of Francis. But I think what I brought back, apart from joy, was the lesson that to live a simple life, it is good to live in the moment.
Challenge some years ago. It was something around the Lenten studies time. And this person said that we would go home and we were first person, then we could pick from one thing from our music collection, one thing from our books collection, and one thing from our Hitchingers collection. And they had to be both something that we used a reasonable amount of time, so it would hurt to give a bit, but also was appropriate to the person we were giving it to. And I would keep that on every Easter. I'd sit down and work out, and some years it is really hard to realise what you've got, but it makes you stop and think about what you have that you can give to someone else.
That is a beautiful practice. I love that. I think I'm going to do that. Sorry, go ahead.
A simple Lenten discipline is to give away one thing each day during the It gets harder.
It gets harder and harder, yes. Yes. Here's half a jar of peanut butter. I wonder who could use that. One of the things that I really struggle with is a lot of the stuff that I have that I really don't need. I've accumulated through gifts, and do you give away the string of pearls that your husband gave you when you finished your PhD? Probably not. No. Do I need a string of pearls? No. But really, what would that say? That would be a message that I think would introduce a great deal of complexity into our relationship.
That's why we were told to put the person first, then the things together.
Yes. I like that a lot. I'm going to be taking that back home with me. Were you going to say?
Spontaneity. The more you think about something, you usually get cold feet. So if you want to do it or give something, give it. And think about it later on.
Good point. Good point. Yeah, so you don't want to sort of immerse yourself in the decision to the point where they have to pry your cold, dead fingers off of it. Yes. What were you going to say?
A lot of New Zealand television programs of the past year have been on simple cooking, a meal for 4 in 10 minutes. But when you get to that, it might be very nice and looks delightful, but you must have been cooking and you've been buying up olives and fruit and shrubs and all sorts of expensive things in order to cook your meal in a few minutes. So you spend an awful lot of money and time getting the goodies to go to make that program. That is awesome.
Yeah, well, so you can prepare this lovely, simple meal, provided that you have an amazingly well-stocked pantry with top quality olive oil that's $50 a bottle.
Go out and buy a carrot or a cabbage.
Right. Yeah. There are trade-offs to be made, right? I mean, the thing is that you oftentimes have to balance one sort of simple priority against another. So I know that during the part of the year when I'm teaching, which just began for us, so I've been in the last month in this sort of mingled dread and denial and panic state, but because our school year just started. But during the part of the year when I'm teaching, I'm just so busy that a 10-minute meal is really asking too much, and so so then yes, I could cook simply, but that would take an hour out of a day that's already going to take everything out of me. And so, you have to sort those things out. Likewise, in terms of clothing, I could probably own less clothing than I do. However, I am a sort of public lecturer type person, and I know students. I don't know what students here are like, but I know what our students are like. And if I wore the same things, over and over and over, day after day after day, I know what they would be doing. They would be writing notes about my wardrobe, and they would not learn any sociology at all. And so, so do I really need, a half dozen pairs of trousers? Not really, but does it make my life simpler in the morning when I have to figure out what's going to work and how I can get out of the house as quickly as possible? It does create a kind of simplicity like that. So I don't think Francis would have been too sympathetic with this. Francis, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Francis actually wrote down a wardrobe for third order people. And I always thought that he was a little bit too acquainted with ladies' lingerie for a guy who is celibate, but I mean, he had been in the clothing business, so I guess that's his excuse. But I know that my wardrobe is nothing like that, even allowing for, 800 years difference. All right, where are we? Let's see. Okay, so lesson number 2. It's not simplicity if it makes you obsess about your stuff. Now, I mentioned the pearl necklace. So part 3 of this is that I wrote in following Francis about how part of my own struggle with simplicity is the fact that I share my household and my life with somebody who doesn't share this value. Now, my husband is an African American who grew up in the projects in inner city Pittsburgh, the council, state housing in inner city Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is brutal in the winter. And he had, one light jacket and, went through the whole winter with, and the snow piles up to, several stories high. And it was pretty much a misery. He wasn't always that poor, but there was a part of his childhood when he was really poor. And also, he's not a Franciscan, and he's not even a Christian, okay? He's an agnostic. So for me to come home and announce that we're going to live simply now, can you imagine his reaction to that? I mean, I'll leave it to your imagination, because I'm not sure I have the dramatic potential to actually sort of convey what that would be like. But, the man drives a Porsche. And I objected as long as I could, and then when he felt like he had earned it and could pay for it, I said, "Sweetie, it's on you. I'm not going to be seen in it, but go right ahead if you feel you need to have that." So I gave my permission. But at any rate, the point is that what do you do when you live with someone who doesn't share this commitment? I can't be the only person here in that position. Anybody else? Yes. All right. So that's not a rhetorical question as of now. What do you do to balance that?
For us, it's very practical. My husband is a Christian, but he doesn't tell me it's. So that's my. He's much better at humility. He's much better at simplicity. He's much better at all those things than I am. So that's a bit cruel for me. And so his choice is to give a lot of money to charities rather than to the church. Mm-hmm. And he says, you give your time and your energy to the church, and that will be enough. Mm-hmm. So that's how we.
Okay. So the actual monetary giving goes to things that he's okay with as well, yeah. And then you give your time.
We talk about it together.
Yeah.
More, and we still give to the church and to Franciscans, and we
sure.
all this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's not his first priority.
Right. Yeah. But you arrive at a consensus about it. You don't just.
And he's extremely supportive of whatever I do.
Yeah.
Quite a good guy.
Yeah, mine is too. I often think, well, if our roles were reversed and he were the Christian and I were the agnostic, he would be doing such a better job of it than I am.
Oh, that's what he said.
He's.
But, for me, the hard bit is when I come home, I don't share some of my stuff with him because he goes, "Yes, darling."
Yeah, right.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
But so that's how.
Yeah. There were some other people who were in that same boat. Yeah.
Not so much with my wife, but with my 2 teenage boys.
Oh yeah.
Can I have a new computer? And would like a new iPad. I'd like a new iPhone. The technology, the clothes, the fashions. Fortunately, they're still at the stage where we still buy their clothing for them, so we have good control over it. But I think that's an issue that I think people face.
Oh yeah.
Their children and what's out there with the modern technology, especially.
That is such a challenge. I mean, because a teenager is kind of the anti-Franciscan, right? Really. It's so hard because it really is part of their developing sense of self to measure up to the people around them. I mean, that's a very real thing. And so to be dismissive of it as someone who's kind of old enough to have grown past that need, at least to some extent, is really hard. They're sort of tender at that stage. You can't just sort of sledgehammer it on them. It's a tough one. Who else? Yeah.
I've come to a sort of compromising conclusion. I don't give away from the household budget, but what I earn is mine in that regard. My discretionary income, you might call it. I will do what I like, give away, buy things for people, sponsor things, whatever. But it's not fair to make the family pay for my whims and cares.
I like that. That's the Elizabeth of Hungary solution, the Elizabethan model of simplicity when it's one person and not the whole household who's committed to this. And she's really been my model as well, because she figured, I mean, she had obviously a lot of resources. Well, they weren't really at her disposal though, because she didn't have a lot of power in the palace. But she reined in her own consumption and didn't tell everybody else how to deal with theirs. And so I like that, and that's pretty much what I've tried to do, in our family. So for instance, we live in a house that's just way too big for two people. I mean, we used to have half custody of my stepdaughter, and so at least when we moved in, at least it was 2.5 people plus a dog. Now we're just rattling around in there, and there's this echo every time we move because it's just too much house. In fact, this is so embarrassing, but it's a tall house. Okay, it's 4 stories, and on the first story is just the entryway and a basement, cellar, and so then you have the main floor, and then you have the floor with the bedroom, and then the top is a little crow's nest study. So from the street, it looks like even more house than it is. And so we live in a kind of borderline neighborhood where we're between a pretty rough area. I mean, Seattle doesn't get very rough, but somewhat poor neighborhood and a really fancy neighborhood. And so people, would come by our house and, to sell something or do a survey or something like this, and they would look up and say, "Is this just one family living here?" and so our line is, and we always have a good laugh at ourselves when we say this, our line is, "It's not big, it's just tall." Yeah, and then we go inside and blush for a half an hour or so. The thing is that this actually cost me a friendship once. There was someone who I hadn't known a long time, but I was very impressed with, who is a kind of a Dorothy Day kind of guy. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so very committed to, actually very, very interested in the Catholic worker movement, very interested in solidarity with the poor, living simply in poor neighborhoods, and kind of being one with that community and all of that. And so the story is that I had a student at that time who was taking my introduction to sociology class, and this was a young Korean American guy who had grown up in a very conservative evangelical Korean church and was coming to terms with his sexuality, because they are not very okay with their members being gay. And so the student and I had started talking, and it was so funny because apparently he saw me going into church one Sunday and followed me in there, and then became a member of our parish and was kind of exploring a place where he could be more himself more comfortably. And I thought that's probably as close to evangelism as I've ever gotten in my life. But I was totally unaware of it. It's probably why it worked. But at any rate, so this kid and I were talking, and I was trying to be supportive and everything. And I thought, well, I could introduce him to my friend, and they would hit it off. And he has a lot of questions, and this guy would be great for him. And so I invited the friend and his wife and my student over for dinner once, and the dinner went well and everything. But then after it was over, the friend said to me, "I'm really surprised at you, because you've got this whole Franciscan thing going on. I'm really surprised at you living in a place like that. Do you think that's consistent with your values?" And I kind of went, "But I mean, I'm not the only person living here." And when we moved into that house, I said, we don't need all this house. We could go, we could live in something, And my husband said, "It's a good financial decision." So I said, "Yeah, whatever," and we went on with it, And so I kept pointing out that, if I wanted to stay married, I was going to have to stay in this house. And he finally said, and this argument went on for months and became increasingly, intense. And he finally said to me, "Well, if you can't live gospel values in your marriage, then maybe you should reconsider that marriage." And I went, "Are you out of your mind? Who gave you the right to say something like that to me?" And so I think that maybe lesson 3 in the complexities of simplicity is you don't get to impose this stuff from without, either on the rest of your family or other people whose practice of simplicity may not measure up to your idea of what it should be. I think we need to be very careful about judging what other people do. In my fellowship, there's a woman who is disabled. She uses a wheelchair. She lives on, a government, I don't know what you would call it here. She lives on disability in special housing, subsidized housing, and so on. And she spends all of her time doing ministry in our diocese and at a national level, actually, mostly with undocumented workers. And so she lives in that community. She's in that community all the time. She catechizes their kids. She does all kinds of stuff. And she's always living very close to the bone. And I've told her that she's my Franciscan icon. I look at her and think, wow, that's what I should be doing. That's the real deal. And then one day she confessed to me that she looks at me and thinks the same thing. And I thought, oh God, you are so screwed up. I had no idea. So we're generous with each other because we know that it's going to look very different in different lives. And so I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So, can I go back to for a moment to what you wrote down or thought about as the most challenging thing for you about simplicity? What did you come up with?
It involves
I'm sorry?
It involves more than your possessions. It also involves your time and your energy.
Okay, so more than possessions, it also involves time and attitude. So what would be an example of one thing concerning time that you would find especially challenging?
I love reading. And when you've got to get up to go, out the next day, and you've got a good book, and you've just got to read another page, and suddenly it's 2 or 3 in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
And so the next day you're grumpy with the kids at school because you're too tired.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, it is worth thinking about our consumption of time, isn't it? How we approach it. Yeah, that's something that I want to come back to later on. Is there somebody else over here?
We were thinking more of the adolescent model.
Sorry?
The adolescent model, and that we're thinking of the expectations of others and of yourself.
Okay, yeah, so...
And we've been talking a lot about that, the expectations, the things that we think that, make it real.
One of the things that I love about traveling is that when you're traveling, you can only have so much of a wardrobe. and the thing about traveling, I used to be the queen of packing light, and I once went on a trip that was South Africa in the winter. I was stopping through Paris where it was summer. I was going to be doing work. I was going to be going on, kind of game drives, and I was going to be a tourist. And I got it all in this tiny little carry-on bag, and I was the champion of packing light, and I was actually really smug about it. And now I have to pack the middle-aged woman's support system. And it's not light anymore, boy. And there's a lot of equipment that I need to get me around the world. But I will say this much, only so much of that space can be clothing now, And I love that. I love it because when I'm traveling, that's when I have a really simple wardrobe. And the decision in the morning is, what did I not wear yesterday that still works with the weather for today? That's it.
It's very important that you keep moving so people don't have
Right. Well, I lead study abroad programs, and so we're all sort of in this, in the same place with each other for 3 months. And I just tell them, it's simplicity. It's, it's a secular school, but I just tell them this is like, your chance to practice the simple life. And they all go, right, it's Italy. I'll go and buy everything there, Who else wrote something challenging about simplicity? Yes.
I don't know, this is something or not. I tend to buy bags of compost instead of putting my scraps in compost.
Ah, okay. So it's kind of by the back door then, isn't it?
Sort of. Yeah, I could do it. Other people do it. But it's just as easy to put down the road, food. Yeah.
But I suppose that you could say that about a lot of things that one might one might do oneself that one gets other people to do. Because isn't it that whole time spending trade-off? Yeah, sort of like the meals that we were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Can you enjoy simplicity?
Can you enjoy it?
Yeah, because I love shopping at op shops. And you don't think I'm spending much less. And flea markets.
So I can buy another pair of black boots because they're not that expensive. Yeah.
I don't throw away clothes and I don't buy new clothes. So I just adjust the clothes that I've had for the last 40 years. And my wardrobe, you don't hang things up. They stand up.
One of the reasons why I buy, I can remember buying a pair of black boots once, and the woman was showing me all these different styles and everything, because it's rainy in Seattle, and you really do need at least one pair anyway. And she was showing me all these fashionable things with these high heels, and this sort of thing that you knew it was in this year, so it was going to be out next year. And I said, sweetie, I need this to last at least a decade. I need these boots to still work when I have to replace the heel and all that kind of stuff, because I'm not going to keep buying them year after year. But yeah. But then when it finally gets to the point where it's really embarrassing, and my stepdaughter tells me, Susan, that's so ghetto. then I realize it's time to let it go. Who else?
Can I say, I don't know whether I was on the right wavelength or not, because I get a bit confused with simplicity. I know it's the consuming stuff, less stuff, and holding lightly and all that. But I actually put down here holding positions and power lightly. That holding places we have in our communities and our societies and positions we might have there and the power we might have there. And holding that lightly as an element of simplicity, or am I just wacky?
No, that's perfect. But give us an example. I mean, I love that. I'm really drawn to the principle of what you're saying. But give us an example of how you might do that.
I guess I struggle with this because I'm at a slightly older age than normal, discovering and doing a whole lot of stuff that I didn't know I could do, and having influence within a certain organisation that I didn't know I could have. And it's actually very heady and very exciting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I think one example of when I did actually manage to do it was that an event needed to be organised, and I was really busy over here. So instead of trying to control everything in that event, allowing somebody else to organise it and just keeping a watching brief. And then when it came to the brochure that goes out for the beginning of the conference, and I was told, well, your photo should be in it, and I just said, no, Heather's organised it, therefore she's the one who writes the welcome, whose photo goes in it and things like that. But that was quite a biggie because, I'm a chairperson, my photo should be there, because everybody should know I'm important. But it's that kind of thing, and not grabbing that front place all the time, but sharing that.
Yeah, I love that. Yes?
Sometimes ignorance is bliss, and you mentioned about your presidential elections. Simplicity for me is not getting hyped up by the media that would have you focus on so many things at the same time, so many pressure areas, and think, well, I've got to think about that one and that one and that one. Limit that input. And that's quite difficult because you're bombarded by written, by television, by radio, by internet.
Oh, yeah.
Everything's available to you at the click of a button.
Yeah.
Bombarded by so many different courses and people wanting your time, your money, your talents.
And this is something that I would like us to come back to later on too. We can consume information be grasping and greedy of it in the same ways that we can consume anything else, you know. And I know that I don't typically ignore the news because I'm so simple-minded. You know, I'm so simple-minded. Actually, that's not a bad description, but because I have the whole simplicity thing down. Mostly, it's because I just can't get around to it, and then to have other things that interest me more. But you know, at the same time, for those who do really get immersed, for those who describe themselves as news junkies, and I know a few people like that, I really think that they feel like they have to know the latest news cycle. You know, they have to, and a lot of it is so trivial. You know, Britney Spears had a wardrobe malfunction. Do I really need to know that? I mean, I need to know the outcome of the presidential election, but, you know, do I need to know every single thing that happens up until that point? Yeah, probably not. But, you know, as a sociologist, I really kind of walk a fine line there, because you're supposed to sort of know something about society. And, yeah, that's a tough one.
I think for me simplicity is quality, not quantity. I love boots, but you know, I've got 3 pairs. I've got a beige pair, I've got a dark brown, I've got a black. And I'll wear them all the time to work. And when the sole gets worn out, I have it resoled. So I keep, you know, and I ask, you know, they cost a fair amount. I was prepared to pay that amount for a good pair. It's put up more than 4, 6, 7, 8 years. So for me, quality is better than quantity.
But that's not the way that we're encouraged to consume, is it? I mean, I grew up partly in Italy, and you know, Italians and French people and probably others, you know, their attitude toward clothing was to buy a few things that were really good quality. And the women there have this amazing eye for, you know, for quality and all that. And that, you know, Americans just don't learn that. I don't know if maybe it's genetic or something, but we don't have it, whatever it is. And so we're encouraged to just buy massive quantities of stuff, so that you have that different outfit every single day, or whatever the goal is. And I think, you know, so that's one of the messages from our culture that we're constantly bombarded with, was get more rather than get better, and maybe better if it lasts. You know, I think that's a better approach.
The advertisements that come on the TV so often are, I'm worth it.
Oh,
I hate them.
Oh, yeah.
They're all worth things. The first one are all worth in God's eyes. I'm not worth it. It's junk that people think I should be putting on my face or all these other
Gillian,
things.
could you speak up a little bit, please?
Sorry?
Can you just speak up a little bit louder?
I see the advertisements about I'm worth it. You know, you deserve it.
You deserve
You
it.
deserve it.
Indulge yourself.
Yeah.
Pamper yourself. I'm worth it. And whoever's sleeping under a tarp down the street from me clearly isn't.
Yeah. But because I'm worth it, according to these adverts, I've got to go and buy it.
Yeah, right. I think what they're really saying is, we're worth it, so give us your money. I mean, you know, if you did this sort of boiled down version of it.
But it's so easy, if you, in the least bit gullible, to think, oh, that would be very nice. No, I'm not just talking about cosmetics and things, all sorts of things. It would be easy to say, well, yes, I could do with that. But you've got to be very careful about, well, do I need it? Is it going to be any good? The problem at home at the moment is that my husband's not allowed to sign ladders because he falls off them. And there's a ladder that keeps coming on the TV screen.
Oh no!
What about your children? What do they say? We've got to be careful about what is put in our faces.
Yeah. You know, there's been research on people's reaction to media messages, and there are people who think that we don't believe anything that we see on television or any of those kinds of things, that we just say, oh, that's only TV, you know, it's not the real world. And then there are people who believe that we believe everything that we see on TV. And in truth, you know, we do talk back to those things. And the process that you're talking about seems like a really good illustration of that, you know, that people don't automatically take things on board just because, you know, the message isn't necessarily received just because the message is sent. And so I think we all have to sort of cultivate that ability to talk back at the adverts and say, no, I'm not. At least maybe I'm actually worth a great deal more than that. And whatever it is you're trying to sell me is not relevant here, if we're talking of worth. Yeah.
Yeah, we can cite all the questions about the overconsumption of the world's resources. Is simplicity going to keep the world in recession in the present financial system? And by not buying, I'm being a devil's advocate, but not buying some, cheap goods from China and putting some poor peasant girl out of work.
Well, right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really good example of the complexity of it. It's something that I've thought about a lot with the locavore movement. Is that big here? The locavore movement, eating locally produced stuff. Okay, yeah, locavore. And one of the things that I think about with that is, okay, first of all, if I'm only going to eat things that were produced within a 100-mile radius of me, or 50, or 200 meters, or whatever it's going to be, then what about that poor guy in Argentina who's trying to make a living, by selling me stuff that's going to be exported to the U.S. Am I putting him out of business? I mean, and then part of the rationale is environmental. So it's about what is the carbon footprint of the transport method. But it depends on how things are transported. Some of them can come from a great distance and still be less of an impact than something that's flown from the other side of the state, for instance. And so this is what I mean when I say that we have to. We really have to be willing to engage these issues and the complexity of them, and not just say, oh, locavore, that sounds like a really cool thing. It's the next thing, and so therefore I'll just do this and then I'll be okay with simplicity.
It's more complicated in New Zealand because we should be a food-producing country for Europe.
Oh, yeah.
Far away you get.
Yes, right. So your stuff is going a very long way. But what if they all decided, well, we don't really need lamb from here, do we? I mean, wouldn't that make kind of a dent in your... They did? Sorry. Didn't mean to open old wounds.
20 million sheep as a result.
Yeah. So, well, exactly. So, I mean, this is a good illustration then of what I'm talking about, of how, we can't pretend it's just local anymore. Because all of these things are intertwined. We're all part of a global system in which, the choices that we make directly affect people on the other side of the world. And it's no good trying to pretend that it's more simple than that. It isn't.
There's also the issue that makes things more complex, that unless we're very careful, we get to the stage we're almost telling ourselves that if something is beautiful, we shouldn't own it. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong, surely, with owning something that is a thing of beauty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree, and I think, to sort of make your life, make your surroundings kind of brutally stark. There's got to be a better balance to it than that. Yeah. But, having some beauty in your life doesn't necessarily mean importing a Murano glass chandelier from Venice, I mean, you could probably do it on a little lesser scale than that. Okay, well, so in the interest of time, let's wrap this up. So I'm pretty much a failure at simplicity. I think I've established that much. At least if living simply means living like Dorothy Day or Mother Teresa, or Francis and Clare for that matter. And you should have thought of that before you invited me, right? But I don't have the option to live the way that they did. At least I don't right now. What I do have, I think, is a somewhat more mature notion of what simplicity is than I did when I was 17 or in my 40s, for that matter. And so I don't want to spiritualize away the challenge of living simply. Francis and Clare's challenge to us, or Christ's challenge to us, for that matter. I don't want to spiritualize it away by saying, well, it's all much more complicated than that. I do think we really need to be serious about that challenge. But I also think that, poverty goes deeper than how many bras you own, how many pairs of black boots you have. And I think the question is, what is the purpose of simplicity? What is it for? What's the point of it? Why do we even try to do this? And I think I could organize my answers, at least, into two categories. The first of which is captured in that expression, live simply so that others can simply live, right? So when people try to live simply, a lot of it's about not over-consuming, not overspending, so that we can share with other people the resources that we have access to, right? And so that's really important. And I think if we're trying to live the Franciscan way, trying to live the gospel way, then we, and if we aren't making some effort to rein in our consumption, at least, to some degree, then we're probably kidding ourselves. And so to sort of put it all at a spiritual level and say, it's really more complicated than how many turquoise necklaces I own, therefore I'll get a few more, that's probably a bit of self-deception going on there. So again, I don't want to trivialize or minimize the need to examine our outward practice of simplicity. I just think that it's a good place to begin, but it's not the end of it. And so I think that Jesus actually gives us the ultimate reason, so this would be my second answer, the ultimate reason for simplicity in the Beatitudes, where he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Isn't that the goal? I mean, the goal is that intimacy, that face-to-face intimacy with God, the beatific vision. That kind of closeness, and I think it was very deliberately, I believe, that Jesus linked that to purity of heart. And in the next session, I would like to explore that a bit more. But Soren Kierkegaard famously said that purity of heart is to will one thing. Not a whole variety of things, not to be pulled in a bunch of different directions all the time, but to will the one thing is what purity of heart is, and that's what will take us to that kind of intimacy with God. And that is going to require a process of transformation, of kenosis, of self-emptying, of stripping away all of the other, accretions that accumulate on us. All the other voices that call us to pay attention to other things. When we will the one thing, I think that is our best shot at really going deep with God. And so that's where I want to go in the next session, to look at that process and see how inner simplicity or a deep kind of inner poverty can bring us to that point of face-to-face intimacy with God. I think that's what Francis and Clare were after. And I think that explains why they didn't just think poverty was a good idea, a nice kind of romantic ideal. They were obsessed with it. They were infatuated with it. I mean, they lived for it. It was so central to who they were, and therefore it's central to who we are as well. And I think that the reason was that they really believed that if there was any way to get closer to Christ, it was going to be through this poverty, whatever it meant. And so in our next session, we'll explore further what that means. So I think we'll knock off here. And thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to tomorrow.